Following the D-Day assaults, the Allies freed many regions of France, but they encountered some unsettling situations in numerous French towns, villages, and cities. When the French resistance and Allied forces started to liberate territories, they were greeted with a variety of joyful scenes as the Germans were driven back toward Germany. However, a lot of women were being punished by the French for their horizontal collaboration with the enemy, which many Allied soldiers encountered. Here, women were shamefully humiliated in public and subjected to cruel punishment for having affairs with the enemy. In public performances known as the ugly carnivals, an estimated 20,000 women had their heads shaved. These ladies endured terrible treatment and suffered immensely as a result. These women had slept with the German enemy, which was their crime. Come examine the horrific torture of the women who had sex with the Nazis today. Please remember to subscribe in order to support our channel. Large tracts of land in many nations were taken by the Germans, who then settled and occupied them. They quickly settled in before beginning to hunt for women to either court, exploit, or mistreat poorly. Numerous women in occupied territories chose to sleep with German soldiers after falling in love with them. There are photos of French girlfriends of German soldiers walking around in their boyfriends' uniforms, which seems to be a common practice in the German army at the time. Everyone in the military and the Wehrmacht understood that Paris was their destination. Many Germans thought of it as a sort of giant cat house, full of scandalous women who would cater to the army's every need. Conquering troops, particularly those with high military ranks, had a lot to offer a girl. They could promise her a future in which they would get married, return to Germany, and start a family after the war. Some women did take advantage of the fact that many German soldiers were lonely and subsequently slept with them, but there were other soldiers who were content to exploit French women, many of whom had spouses and partners who had enlisted in the French military. After falling in love, several ladies married their German partners, followed them everywhere they went, frequently across hazardous territory, and even joined them in prison camps. Everywhere the German army went, there were almost 200,000 infants born in France to German fathers and French mothers. 12,000 babies were born in Norway, and 900 kids born to German fathers were registered in the Channel Islands as well. The liberators and elements of the resistance, however, frequently went to great efforts to punish those women who they felt were working with the Germans and who had slept with the enemy as the war shifted against them, forcing them to retreat and give up territory. The term horizontal collaboration described the romantic or sexual relationship that many women in France or occupied territories had with German occupying forces when those territories fell. Many women were subjected to gruesome punishment for their role as collaborators following the liberation of France. Many of the incidents were genuinely horrifying and savage. Some women in Norway were banished from their homelands, prosecuted, and imprisoned after being accused of such collaboration. Children from these partnerships were also exiled and deemed illegitimate because they were seen as part of the betrayal. During World War II, sleeping with the enemy was seen in many countries as one of the worst sins and embarrassments one could do. However, many women in France endured a horrifying ordeal that was intended to humiliate and punish them in public for having an affair with the enemy. In public spectacles, many people had their heads shaved, and large audiences gathered to watch resistance fighters trim a woman's flowing hair. For the French military, this was a symbol of humiliation and retaliation, but it was also a penalty for adultery that went all the way back to the Dark Ages. When German women were accused of sleeping with non-Aryans or foreign captives on farms during World War II, the Nazi regime ordered that they be publicly punished by having their heads shaved. However, the images inside French towns were quite frightening, with people yelling for the women to be punished in a horrible manner. Known as the ugly carnival, many women were dragged into town squares, made to have their hair shaved, and then frequently assaulted, struck, and mistreated by other crowd members. They were frequently subjected to various forms of punishment, including being spit at and thrown objects at by crowds. Many were stripped half-naked and made to march through the streets where they were kicked, beaten, and occasionally brutally beaten by mobs. In order to humiliate them, make them feel even worse, and reveal what they had been subjected to, some ladies were even smeared in tar after being severely beaten and bleeding during these attacks. The entire crowd could see what the women had done because several of them had swastikas painted or applied on their bodies or foreheads with lipstick. According to reports, these ladies had the look of a hunted animal in the hands of their tormentors, and the French were harvesting collaborators, cutting their hair off, and burning it in huge piles, which one could smell miles away. Additionally, female participants were beaten severely and made to carry the gauntlet. I saw 4 girls who had been led through the streets and I rushed towards them to take a photograph, remarked one photographer who documented these occurrences. I immediately found myself at the front of the procession, and the locals believed that I was the female soldier who had taken them or something. I received congratulations and kisses while the poor girls were slapped and spat on. To show more people what they had accomplished, many of the women were also paraded throughout towns and cities on lorries. When Churchill's private secretary Jacques Colville noticed this, he said, "I saw an open truck go by, with a dozen wretched women in the back, to the sound of jeers and jeering from the French people. They shaved off every hair on their heads. They were hanging their heads in embarrassment, crying." Even though I was appalled by this brutality, I reasoned that we British weren't the best judges because we hadn't had an invasion or occupation in about 900 years. Women were always considered the primary scapegoats, while some men were also shaved for working in German factories. Some of these women were wrongfully subjected to the trauma because they were in conflict with other women and men who would testify about their resistance, even though many of them were not genuinely guilty of sleeping with the enemy. The German soldiers also mistreated several of the ladies who were humiliated, and these instances of public humiliation were broadcast throughout France. Some Allied soldiers were sympathetic to the fact that much of France had suffered greatly under the German rule, but they were nonetheless horrified by the obvious torture of the ladies. The dread of collaboration was so great that many women were killed and shot dead by French soldiers if they were discovered in possession of German weapons, even before they could defend themselves. Although it was possible that these weapons were being collected for the resistance, troops nevertheless killed both men and women for this reason. Because an American officer in the 1st Infantry Division said that he had seen 5 women in a town and 4 women in German uniforms acting as snipers in trees, there was also concern in France about French women aiding the German forces. However, many women were singled out because, during the occupation, they had a better quality of life than the rest of the French population, had not been starved, had been provided with better food, and had benefited greatly from traveling with a German soldier, including trips to various locations and lenient treatment from other German officers. At least 20,000 women have reportedly had their heads shaved, and the number might be far higher. The situation was considerably worse in Paris, where women and prostitutes were executed for taking German soldiers as customers, and even members of the nobility were shaved for conspiring with German officers. In certain parts of France, German soldiers and French women behaved largely in a professional manner. For instance, some women who were living alone, such female schoolteachers, were compelled to live with soldiers. They were punished after the war for supposedly lying to the German soldiers, but this was untrue. During the occupation, many women thought that working with the enemy was the only option to provide food for themselves and their children. However, the scenes of the ugly carnival were among the most horrifying of the Second World War because of the brutality perpetrated on the women who were shaved or made to run the gauntlet in towns, which occasionally led to their deaths. The moral anger against women who had slept with the enemy was widespread throughout France, and their actions were considered the greatest embarrassment possible and equivalent to treason. Even the most seasoned Allied soldier was shocked by the events that transpired in numerous French settlements, and the pictures of French ladies with swastikas emblazoned on them and without hair still linger to this day. Thank you for viewing. Please remember to subscribe in order to support our station. Thank you for viewing.